And now it's both my privilege and my pleasure to introduce someone who is changing lives the planet over. Dr. Bruce Lipton. His history is one that's filled with academic start. He's a cellular biologist, and what he teaches is life. Please join me in welcoming Bruce Lipton.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. It's a great opportunity for me to come here and spread this information for you because, first of all, I think you're going to find it's very informative and nothing better than most empowering, because there's a whole new understanding going on in the world of biology, and it really relates to our understanding of parenting. And what really gets me into this is that, first of all, I'm a cellular biologist, and my work is, I'm just looking at the technology here. My work at this moment is involved with developmental cellular biology. When I was at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine, I was involved with teaching embryology and histology and the understanding of development in general. And so, interestingly enough, my work started carrying on further and further in this field. And I really wasn't actually as motivated to jump into conscious parenting until after I read this article in the New Yorker magazine back in 1998. And this article, Do Parents Matter?, really grabbed me. And it's really based on a book called The Nurture Assumption by Judith Harris. Now, the premise of the book is this, is that Judith raised two kids, her own natural child and an adopted child. And in the process, her own natural child apparently turned out wonderfully beautifully, as she described, and the adopted child became a delinquent and a troublemaker and all kinds of other things. She blamed on this parenting issue on her own parenting skills, and as a result of that, she really held a lot of shame over her parenting. And then at one point she came up into reading psychology. She's not a degreed person, but she was writing textbooks by collecting data, and got into an understanding of psychology that let her see something very different. What she actually started to turn out was the fact that she really said, oh, parents matter less than you think and peers matter more. She got to the point of actually rationalizing the reality of having two different divergent children coming from the same parenting. Well, the problem with that, of course, is she really then tried to tell the public that parents don't matter at all, that anybody could have some kids and all you have to do is send them to the daycare center or send them to child care, send them to school, and everything will be taken care of for you. And I all of a sudden I read this and I went, yikes, I cannot believe this, because it's really, it was just abominable to me as a developmental biologist to hear this, so I really got much more on the bandwagon to come out and try and talk about conscious parenting. And really what it really relates to is this, is that first of all, there is no blame and shame on parenting for the following reason. As a group, as a population, as a nation, we really haven't been given the proper parenting skills to really understand how to do parenting. And therefore, to try and blame yourself for parenting issues without having proper teaching in this area also means there is no blame. There will be after the lecture, though, by the time I tell you how it's done. But no, really what I want to try to tell you is that, first of all, parenting, it's not a list of things to do, and I'm not going to provide a list of things to do. Parenting is a way of life. And I really want to talk about what it really means to be a conscious parent in this regard. And basically what the whole premise of my being up here has to do with this. Psychology is an effort to understand how the nervous system works and behaviorally, and it's based on biology. Well, what's happened in the last few years is that biology has undergone a tremendous renaissance in awareness. And the relevance is psychology has never kept up with it. And so therefore there's this lag space. And so my important contribution, I hope, in this area is if I provide you with the newest understanding of biology, it will preclude our old ideas about a psychology, especially because we've also been raised in a generation or population that is dealing with what is called irresponsibility. That we claim no responsibility, that it's not our issues. If there's anything wrong with our health, it has to do with the body's issues. If there's anything wrong with our behavior, it must be something to do with genetics or some other thing. And as a result, we would like to put aside responsibility. Unfortunately, as the new biology reveals, we are very, very personally responsible. But unless you know that responsibility and how it works, then we're really just walking blindly into the field. So what I'm planning to do tonight is this. The first part is I'm going to talk to you about the new biology and why this is relevant. You have to understand that because once you see how the cells actually work, all of a sudden you say, oh my goodness, our belief in things like genes controlling biology and all this other stuff is not accurate at all. There's a new understanding, and what's really wonderful about it, it is really fully empowering. So let me start off with this. I'm a scientist. I came in through the system of conventional academia. I used to teach and research at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine, where I said I was teaching in embryology and development and histology. And I also was carrying out research on cloning human cells. And that was really what provided me the insight into how biology actually works, by looking at the mechanisms of individual cells as they express their developmental potential. But as a scientist, I was also groomed with the mission statement of science, which is the conventional belief that science is following right now. And it's interesting because this mission statement of science is actually from 1650, but it's still the very same mission statement. And the mission is to obtain knowledge that can be used to dominate and control nature. This is what the essence of science is trying to do. Unfortunately, now that I really understand a lot more, I realize this is a really scary proposition to be working on. It doesn't work that way. We really should be understanding how we incorporate ourselves in the community of nature, not to dominate nature, but how to participate in the community. And this is also the effort of understanding about parenting, because we are a community of people, and each person is made out of a community of cells. So basically, this was the mission statement of science. And it was really interesting because in order for us to dominate and control nature, the first thing we actually have to do as scientists is identify what is the natural control that exists in biology. For the simple reason is, if I know what the natural control is, then I can manipulate that. So the question that scientists first faced after asking this question in 1650 is, where is the control in biology? Well, interestingly enough, there were two opposing possibilities. One was that the control came from the outside and impressed itself on the cellular mechanisms. And two, the control was from the inside, that within the cell there were chemicals or agents that were responsible for directing its control. Those that believe that the control is from the outside have historically been known as spiritualists. That there's some spiritual entity, a soul, a former, as Plato would have talked about, the reality, something out there giving shape to us. In the contrasting point of view, those that believed that the control was from the inside were actually called mechanists. Why? Because they presumed that the cell was a mechanism, and as such, that the parts of the mechanism controlled the expression of the mechanism. Well, this is an older view of the two potentials, outside and inside control. In more recent years, actually, it's the same idea, but now we talk about the difference between nature and nurture. That we say nature represents some kind of control mechanism present inside the cell that controls the biology. Today, we are actually talking about genes in this regard. Nurture talks about the environment. So basically, the difference is this. Are we controlled by the genes from within, heredity, or are we controlled from the environment or some combination? And the interesting thing is, for hundreds of years, this pendulum was swinging back and forth. At some time, nurture was more predominant in belief, and at other times, nature was more predominant in belief. But the pendulum stopped swinging essentially in 1859. In 1859, Charles Darwin presented the world with The Origin of Species, the theory of evolution. And in this, it was totally expressed that the traits that an individual expresses are passed from the parent to the child. Well, as soon as scientists agreed that this was actually happening, then they actually came to the conclusion, then whatever is controlling my traits, my characteristics, must have been physically passed from the parents. That ended the nature of spiritual understanding, because at that point we became very materialistic, because we said we must be able to find what is that physical stuff that's being passed from one generation to the next generation. At the time Darwin started this, we had no knowledge of genes. They were just called hereditary factors at that time. 100 years of focused research by science said, look, we know it's in this material that's being passed. It took 100 years to figure out what it was. And it turns out it's the double helix of DNA. So when Watson and Crick presented the understanding of the genetic code in 1953, all of science said, wow, we finally got it. The secret, the answer to life. It's all in the genes. It's in this stuff that we pass, the hereditary material. Well, the interesting understanding about this hereditary material is that not only does it provide for our structure, but it also presumably provides for our other characteristics. And the flow of information, and this is the important understanding, the flow of information says in biology it unfolds, information unfolds. Where does it start from? Well, it presumably starts from the DNA. And then the information in the DNA blueprint is translated into another molecule called RNA. RNA is like a Xerox copy of the gene. The original DNA stays in the nucleus of the cell. The RNA, the blueprints, leave the nucleus of the cell and then enter into the cytoplasm, where they're used to make the protein. You are a protein machine. This is a fact. You look in the mirror, you want to look at yourself, all of the characteristics that you see are due to the protein molecules that make up your body. Then, in fact, the behavior that you express is from the protein molecules in the body. You are a protein mechanism. Well, the interesting part about this is follows. It says this. This belief became so ingrained that Francis Crick, one of the co-founders of the genetic theory, came up with what he called the central dogma. And what this means is an inviolable truth. Well, the interesting thing about it is this. Dogma is not a scientific term. Dogma is a religious term. And the interesting understanding then says this. The fundamental belief in science is actually a religious belief in the DNA being the source of who and what we are. And all of a sudden, we all bought it. And for years now, since 1953, 50 years of imprinting this belief upon us. It's been printed in every textbook from elementary school up through graduate level education, that what's going on is that the DNA controls who you are. It's actually in textbooks referred to as the primacy of DNA, which means first cause. So whenever you want to find out what about your characters or your traits, the first cause appears to be the DNA. That leads us to the belief in genetic determinism. And the belief in genetic determinism at first was your physical structures were determined by the genes. Now we've transcended that because we're so invested in genes in our world that we now buy that genes are not only for your physical structure, but genes provide for emotional and behavioral characteristics as well. Well, all of a sudden it says then who you are was pre-programmed in your genes. And that's what the concept of genetic determinism means. You are already determined when the sperm and egg come together. Your life is already a program that unfolds after that. Well, in this case, then you understand why when a woman goes for an OBGYN checkup, what is the doctor primarily concerned with? He asks, are you eating well? Are you exercising well? Are you getting enough fresh air? What is he wanting to find out? Well, he wants to find out if you're nourishing this baby that's developing. And that's the only thing he asks. Why is that his only concern? Are you nourishing the baby? And the reason is simply this, is that if the baby's development is genetically controlled, then what does the mother have to do but just feed it? The genes will unfold and express the whole thing. So that in this OBGYN checkup, we're really not asking the mother about her attitudes and her beliefs and her concerns about life, because this genetic thing is developing on its own, and all we need is to feed it. So basically, you can see why there's a limited participation in the early pregnancy stages. Well, the issue about it is this. If you're controlled by your genes and your fate is determined by your genes, then you all of a sudden, think about this, are a victim of heredity. Why? You didn't select your genes when you got them. You can't really just say, okay, give me another set of genes. You are stuck with the genes that program your life. And since you didn't pick them and you can't change them, then you've got them and you're the victim. And what this has created in our whole world is what? A belief of powerlessness. We're powerless. Look, cancer's running in my family. I now live in fear because at some point I anticipate that this cancer is going to hit me as well. And all of a sudden you find yourself powerless, and then what do we become? Irresponsible. And the reason is why? If you can't do anything about it, then why even make an effort to do anything about it? So we have groomed a very large population of people to feel that they are victims of their heredity and there's nothing they can do about it. Well, science always has an answer because remember, their mission statement was what? To be able to dominate and control nature. Now that we know that presumably the genes control everything and that the genes give you characteristics, then science said we have one last project. It's called the Human Genome Project. And why is this project so important? Well, once I make a compendium, a full list of all the human genes, then if anybody comes in and says, I have a problem with my life, and in fact, they actually thought there were genes, actually still in science journals, happiness genes. So I'll give you that as an example. If you got stuck with a sucky happy gene, then your whole life is going to be, oh man, I can't get happy. Well, you go to the doctor, and presumably if we have the whole list of genes, maybe you can get some genetic engineering, get new happy genes. Well, this is what the intention was of the Human Genome Project. If to make a complete list of all the genes so that if anybody has a problem with their genetics, we can, using genetic engineering, provide them with new genes. So the project gets off the ground in 1989. And here's the beautiful part. Now think about this. They already know how biology works. It's in the central dogma. DNA, RNA, and protein. We already know that. Well, the interesting understanding goes like this. If we already know how it works, then before they even did the project, they actually knew how many genes they were going to find for this reason. Each protein in your body uses a gene as a blueprint. At the time in 1989, when they started the project, it was estimated there were 100,000 proteins in the body. Today, it's probably 250,000 different proteins. But in 1989, they said there were 100,000 different proteins. Well, if I have a gene for each protein, then how many genes does that start off with? And the answer, of course, is 100,000 genes. We already know that. Now, the other thing is they also recognize there are genes that don't make proteins. But these genes regulate the other genes so that there are genes that control genes. And those genes are called regulatory DNA. Back then, it was estimated the minimum number of regulatory genes was 40,000. So when I put that number together, I say, okay, before the project gets off the ground, all these scientists who know how it works say, when the project gets done, we're going to have at least 140,000 genes in our compendium. 10, 12 years of this Human Genome Project, and in 2001, the results are released, and what are they? The answer is not 140,000 genes as anticipated. The answer is 34,000 genes. Now, all of a sudden, you have to recognize this shocked the scientists. In fact, most of these scientists were caught with their pants down, their genes exposed, and they were really much concerned about the reality that they made a mistake. Well, it's a big mistake. The reason is this. 2/3 of the genes that were required don't even exist. And all of a sudden it says, well, what does that mean? The answer is this. We made an assumption that we knew how it worked. We really didn't know how it worked. And to show you that, in the issue of the Human Genome Project in Nature, a Nobel laureate, David Baltimore, he is the geneticist and a Nobel Prize-winning geneticist at that, very prominent in the world, had a special article in the issue of Nature describing the results of the Human Genome Project. And in the conclusion of his results, this is what he writes. But unless the human genome contains a lot of genes that are opaque to our computers, it is clear that we do not gain or undoubted complexity over worms and plants by using more genes. This is the most important paragraph, and it goes, understanding what does give us our complexity, our enormous behavioral repertoire, our ability to produce conscious action, our remarkable physical coordination, our ability to use precisely tuned alterations in response to external variations in the environment, our learning, our memory, need I go on, remains a challenge for the future. The relevance of this article is understanding what does give us our complexity remains a challenge for the future. So it's interesting, after 12 years of the Human Genome Project, the results come in, and what happened in 12 years? We found out we don't know how it works. It doesn't work the way we thought it worked. We cannot be controlled by genes because there are not enough of them. There are other mechanisms of control. And this is the radical change that is coming about in biology to identify what is it that controls biology. Well, just to let you know, the conventional point of view, even after the Human Genome Project, is still the same. This article, which is in the issue of Science, is dealt with nuclear dynamics. Nuclear means the nucleus of the cell, where all the genes are, the dynamics of what was going on in the nucleus of a cell. And this is a whole series of articles on that, and this is the first page, an introduction to introduce the articles that were presented in this section. And it's interesting because the first sentence gives it away right there. And the first sentence says, for higher organisms, the nucleus is the command center of the cell. The nucleus is where all the genes are. Since the genes still presumably control biology and all the genes are in the nucleus, then the nucleus is given the nature of being the command center controlling all of cells. Well, the reality is, what does that mean? It means this. In our belief system, the nucleus of the cell, where the genes are, is tantamount to the brain, because the brain is our command center for the human body, the command center for the cell. The nucleus would be tantamount to the brain. I presume that makes sense right there. But now here comes the whole thing that just pulls the rug out of conventional biology. And it's simple. It's a simple logic statement. It goes like this. If you remove the brain from any living organism, there's an immediate and necessary consequence of that action. What is it? Death. Absolutely. Well, here's an interesting point. I remove the nucleus from a cell. The cell doesn't die. It continues living and expressing all of the behaviors it had before. Some cells can live for 2 or more months with no genes in it. The cells are not sitting there. They're moving around. They're eating, digesting food, building their body, negotiating with other cells in the environment, recognizing toxins and predators in the field, and using the appropriate behavior to protect themselves. Essentially, what I'm telling you is this. Without any genes in the cell still has the coordinated behavior of life. It's still a living system, and it's moving and going even with no genes. And there's an important conclusion to that. And the answer is very simply, the nucleus cannot be the brain of the cell because there's apparently still a brain inside the cell even though there are no genes in it. Well, that's the important understanding is, then what controls biology is not the genes. Nope, it's something else. Well, the medical model, which we're all using in our health system right now, is conventional medicine says that you are a biochemical machine controlled by genes. Well, guess what? The medical model, defunct. It cannot be controlled by genes. And so the issue is, what is controlling biology? And all of a sudden, this is very relevant for all of us, because before we stood back and said, the genes were making me do this. Now the question is, what gives us the character and traits of our lives? So I'm going to talk about cells. And now when I'm going to talk about cells in this beginning part, don't get freaky and say, what's he talking about cells? We're people. Let me explain something to you. You might look in the mirror and see yourself as a single entity, but as a cellular biologist, I can tell you that's a mistaken perception for the following reason. You are made out of trillions of cells. Every cell is a sentient living organism. Why? Well, in my research, I used to clone human cells, take them out of a body, put them in a tissue culture dish, and watch them grow and develop and behave. And the reality is they didn't need your whole body to carry out their lives. Here's the point. We have failed to recognize that we actually are not a single entity. We are indeed a community of cells. That when we talk about health and disease, really what you're talking about is the politics of how the cells in the community are getting along or not getting along, as the case may be. So what I want to talk about is how cells work. And the reason why I'm going to bring this up and the relevance of it is this. Important fact. There is no new function in this entire human body that's not already present in every single cell. Every cell has every system that you express in your body. That has a digestive system, respiratory, nervous system, cardiovascular system, musculoskeletal system, a nervous system, immune system, an endocrine system. It's all in there. So why this is important is you can understand the human by studying the cell, because the human is just collective amoebic consciousness. We are all these amoebas that have come together to share their lives and give us the characters and traits that we express. We cannot express a trait that a cell cannot express because we're made out of cells. So talking about cells will give you insight into your own life. How do cells work? Well, I will show you this little model. And if you can understand what this model represents, then you can understand all about biology. And it works like this. Here's a mechanism. It's got gears that drive. Can you understand that the gears that drive, when they engage, I can connect them to do different things? I can make the gears drive a clock. I can make the gears drive wheels and make a motor out of it. I can make the gears drive a wearing blender so you can have juice in the morning. Basically, the gears are a mechanism, and I can design the mechanism to create any particular function. So the mechanism is the gears, but you need a drive force. The force, like a motor, to make the gears move. Otherwise, it'll be like a watch that's unwound. It'll just sit there. It won't do anything. So life has force to move the gears. But you don't want the gears running all the time. You want to regulate them. So you want some things to be turned on and some things to be turned off. So what do we need? A switch. And then, in addition to that, most good machine mechanisms also come with a gauge to give you a value of the performance of how it's operating and how it's running. So I ask you simply, can you understand how this thing works? I push the switch, the motor turns, moves the gears carry out a function, and in the process I can watch the gauge and see the character or quality of the machine. Does that so far makes simple sense? Well, now using this, let me explain piece by piece the biology by explaining each one of these, okay? Number one, what controls this mechanism? Now you look at this picture. Anybody want to offer a suggestion? Yell it out, please. Anybody? It's very quiet. Feedback, well, that's one source. Thought. Well, how about this machine that we're looking at? Pushing the button. The switch would be like the control, right? This is our belief system and has been, but here's the point. It's not really the control. It's a way of controlling it for the reason is this. I could have this mechanism sit here all the time, but if nobody pushes the button, then it just will sit there. So the control is not the button itself. The control is what pushes the button. See? And why that's relevant is we keep studying the mechanism, but we fail to understand who is actually pushing the button. And I'm certainly going to try and explain that in the next few minutes. So, first of all, let's explain the mechanism. The mechanism is this. This is the mechanism. Your human biology. I told you the mechanism is what? Made out of proteins. Well, an interesting understanding of the mechanism, I'll use this picture of the transmission out of my car. And the reason why is what it shows, this is called an exploded diagram, and briefly what you really understand about an exploded diagram is this, is that this mechanism is made out of hundreds of different parts, each part with its own shape and unique structure, and the structures integrate with each other, and when you put them all together, they create the function of the transmission. And so basically it says a lot of parts come together, each part being different, but they integrate to make a functional mechanism. The point? The biology of the cell has over 100,000 different parts that make it up. Each part has a different shape, structure, and function. The parts are called proteins. All these proteins integrate, just like in the transmission, they integrate, engage with each other, and carry out their functions. What's different about the parts in the transmission and parts in the cell is organic. The parts are organic. They don't look like man-made gears and nuts and bolts. They have an amorphic look, a natural biological look to them. So the proteins, although they don't look the same as gears, they actually function the same as gears. So let me give you an example of a protein. This protein in your body, in every one of our bodies, is all the same. It's called calmodulin. It has a unique three-dimensional shape to it. And the question is, what gives each protein, because each protein has its own unique shape, where is the shape, where does it come from? And the answer is, surprisingly enough, underneath the structure is a backbone. And it's just like your own backbone gives you your shape, and you can change your shape, see, moving around by changing the backbone. There's a backbone inside the protein. Very simply, let me explain this. With over 200,000 different proteins, I can tell you this. Although there are 200,000 different ones, they all share the same structural foundation. All proteins are linear strings. They're beaded strings where the beads represent amino acids. So when you're in the health food store and you're buying amino acids, you're buying the component beads that make the proteins in your body. There are over 21 different amino acids that are naturally used in biology. And the fact is, this is misleading because this is kind of a flexible backbone, doesn't have any rigidity. So I'm going to show you using these models as pipe fittings right here as models of amino acids. Imagine 21 different shapes. I'm only showing you 3. The 3 shapes are a 45-degree angle, or excuse me, a 90-degree angle, a 45-degree angle, and a straight one. So that's 3 out of 21 possible shapes. Now, how do they work? Well, they're like poppet beads. They plug into each other. So as I plug them in, all of a sudden you start to see I'm creating a chain, but the chain is very rigid. It's not like the poppet bead chain I just showed you a minute ago. And as I assemble this, we're creating a rigid backbone that will give the shape to a protein. Okay? So here's the way I assembled it this way. Simple question, very simple. If I disassemble this and reassemble it using a different sequence, will I get the same shape, yes or no? No. And so what's different between all of the proteins? The sequence of the amino acids that make up the chains. And there are 21 different ones. So therefore, you can imagine the great variety of different shapes that all the proteins have. And that's why we have so many different ones. Okay? So now we understand that the backbone is really giving the shape to it. Then I want to say this. Can you understand how this metal machine works? It's called a watch. Can you understand that gear A, when it turns right here, moves gear B? When gear B turns, it turns gear C? Does that all make sense to you? Well, if that makes sense, how about if I do this? I throw proteins on top of the gears. Now, they don't look like gears to our normal perception, but if we recognize they're organic gears, can I ask you a question now and say, can you see that if a protein A turns, it will turn protein B, and when protein B turns, it turns protein C? Does that make sense to you? Well, then all of a sudden I say, cool, because what I'm going to do is remove the metal. And now what do we have? Protein gears. And all of a sudden you already said, well, yeah, protein A turns B, turns C. Now you recognize this is how the machinery of the cell works. Now we have all different kinds of groupings of proteins, and they're grouped together in what are called pathways. Meaning, I have digestive proteins, I have respiratory proteins, I have neural proteins, I have